insights on this very important story.
My pleasure.
Yeah. I don't think it's too hard to figure out what's going on here. You don't need to be an investigative journalist to figure out what's going on. You just have to like have a basic understanding of what America's role in the world is and just listen to what American public officials have said about it. Are you still there, folks? We're getting quotes about the stream ending. We back. What's going on? Did we lose you? Did you lose me? Refresh. The man's trying to shut me down. The man's trying to shut me down, but I'm still here. You think you can get rid of me that easy, huh? Huh? I'm not going anywhere. Whoever that was just now, the CIA, the NSA, CSIS, Mossad, MI6, whoever it is, it's going to take a lot. I'm behind like so many firewalls right now. I'm behind a bunch of different firewalls. It's like that scene in Sneakers when you see the signal bouncing all over all the different satellites and everything. That's what happens when you try to take down the stream. It get bounced all over the place. I'm behind 7 boxies. That's right. The Queen of B. This stream is protected by the Queen of B. They blew up the Twitch pipeline. That's a classic reference. Yeah, I've been around a little while. It's true. Anyway, I don't know that was. I didn't click anything on my hand. I did the viewers, and I'm in a new session. Broadcast got interrupted somehow, but I don't really know what that was about. But I'm here now. That's the most important thing. I'm here now, and so are you folks. The dive team's closing in on Rob's Sea Lab. That would be funny if I was at a secret underwater base this whole time. That would be cool. That'd be very cool. Anyway, let's look at more of we watched the CGTN clip with Jeffrey Sachs. Let's continue now. Let's continue. Oh, you know what? This seems to be another relevant clip as well. You know? There's a CGTN Mearsheimer interview as well about the Ukraine crisis. So maybe we should take a look at that as well, considering how Mearsheimer was one of the analysts who years ago was just like problematic fave, that's right. Was just like plainly telling people this is a red line that we're pushing up against and Ukraine's going to get wrecked. And lo and behold, that is exactly what has happened. And rather than like learn from any of that, like what he was saying, we've simply decided to instead accuse him of being like a Putin propagandist. That's what we've done instead of like trying to say like, hey, why did this guy correctly predict exactly what was going to happen? Maybe there is something to that. Instead, we're just like, why does he love Russia? Yeah, I don't believe that this is just the CGTN account. Let's take a look at this. That seems way louder now, doesn't it? He wants to hug and smooch Russia.
Welcome to Dialogue. As the Ukraine war approaches the one-year anniversary, the
The spillover effects of the conflict has been felt by people both on and off the battlefield. What's happened in the last year, and how has this war changed the world? Looking beyond the Ukraine war, what kind of a world will we have? To help answer these questions, I'm happy to have on our show Professor John J. Mearshammer, R. Vandell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of the Political Science Department at the University of Chicago. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion. So, John, flashing back to February 2022 when the war broke out, there were many debates about the causes of the war, factors leading to the war. Of course, a lot of finger pointing and blaming at each other. And you are known in the Western world as almost the lone voice in blaming U.S. Obsession with the NATO expansion to Ukraine, which you pointed out for years has been viewed in Russia as a grave threat to its national security. Are you still holding that view?
Yes, I think the conventional wisdom in the West has long been that Vladimir Putin was an imperialist and he was determined to conquer Ukraine and make it part of a greater Russia, or he was interested in recreating the Soviet Union. There is no evidence to support that, and all the evidence indicates that he was fearful that the West was trying to make Ukraine a bulwark, a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And the principal element of the West strategy was NATO expansion into Ukraine. Putin and his advisors made it clear for many years that this was simply unacceptable. And if the West continued to push NATO eastward into Ukraine, there would be serious trouble. And of course, that's exactly what happened. And I have no reason to change my view, because if you look at people in the West and people in Ukraine who talk about the possibility of a peace involving Ukraine and Russia, they automatically focus on the subject of NATO expansion and the question of whether Ukraine can be neutral. That tells me that my basic argument from the start was correct, that this is really, at its core, all about NATO expansion.
And as we talked about before, like people say, well, Ukraine's not part of NATO. What do you, they're not. What was Putin so anxious about that he had to invade Ukraine? They're not part of NATO, but it's like, functionally, again, what is who's arming Ukraine? It's NATO. It's the NATO countries that have been propping up and arming Ukraine for the last 10 years. So it's like, I think the concerns are still valid when NATO is pumping arms into the country. And since this invasion started, since the war started, it's been like Russia has suggested that they view this as a conflict against NATO. And like, what has NATO done to prove them wrong? Like, they're giving them everything but troops. They're just making sure that it's being fought entirely by Ukrainian proxies, even though that's not even true, because there's Western volunteers. There's Western volunteers and advisors or whatever, coordinating things and coordinating these massive arms deals. But it's like, yeah, NATO's been pumping weapons into the country and prolonging this whole conflict. So I think it's a fairly legitimate concern if that's the case.
Okay, NATO expansion now with 1 year past, almost past, about the war. So do you see a possibility still there for Ukraine, membership for Ukraine?
I think it's extremely unlikely. And I think that what's going to happen here is that Ukraine is going to be turned into a dysfunctional rump state. And by that, I mean it's going to lose a big chunk of territory in its east.
And Western Ukraine is going to be it's just ripe for total exploitation by these Western financial interests. Now that all the labor protections have been removed, the austerity has been implemented. Usually everything's being privatized. Usually, in a war, it's the opposite. Industries get nationalized during a war. You'll notice in Ukraine, it's been the exact opposite. All these industries are being privatized even further. All these labor protections are being destroyed even further. So not only are they going to lose territory, but what remains is primed to be absolutely dominated by Western capital, which is not going to help, as we know, not going to help average people there. It'll be great for the Ukrainian pro-Western elite. It's going to be fantastic for them. Not so much for the average person. You know, as the last vestiges of what used to be a really robust and I think incredible legacy of Ukrainian socialism is completely wiped away. You know, as we've seen before time and time again, that's not going to be a recipe for success for the people that actually have to live there afterwards.
And furthermore, its economy is going to be
Good morning up the
wrecked.
Reds.
The Russians are in the process of trying to destroy Ukraine so that the remnant state that's left is so weak that it either cannot join NATO, or if it does join NATO, it's more of a problem for the alliance than it is an asset.
It's going to be
What
swarmed
about
with all these
the continuity
heavily armed,
or
highly
continuation,
trained
of military support
veterans
from
as well.
Washington, from Brussels.
That's when the blowback's going to
of,
start.
You know, of tanks or even probably fighter jet later on. And do you see any signs of a fatigue, either on European countries or on the U.S. side?
I think that the West will continue to support the Ukrainians as much as possible. The West is deeply committed to this war. The view in the West is that the United States and its allies cannot afford to lose. So I think we will continue to give the Ukrainians as much military aid as we can. The problem that the West faces and the Ukrainians face is that what they really need is artillery. This is a war of attrition, and the key military system or the key weapon that matters in a war of attrition is artillery. And the Russians have a huge advantage in artillery.
I will say, I would encourage people to listen to this latest episode of the Insurgents podcast that we did. Oh, sorry, that's the theme song. Didn't mean to put that on. I would encourage people to listen to the latest episode we did with Eric Sperling of Just Foreign Policy, a anti-war think tank, which was a good conversation. And he was like a lot more optimistic than I am that there's starting to be appetite, even with the words what Biden said when he met with Zelensky the other day. There is starting to be more of an appetite amongst the Washington elite outside of this very, very hawkish faction for de-escalation and dialogue. And I'll link the interview there. Excuse me. Wheezing over here. Was really kind of like, yeah, it was. Eric was a lot more optimistic about the idea that there will be a negotiation, that there is starting to be an acceptance in Washington that that's where things are going, despite what Biden just said, and answered that question as well about what Biden's rhetoric was versus like what the actual mood in Washington is. I don't know how much truth there is to that. You know, it seems like to me that America is committed to extending it even longer, but I would encourage people to at least listen to what Eric's points on that, because it was interesting to hear his perspective on it.
Some people estimate that the Russians have 6-to-1 or 7-to-1 more artillery tubes than the Ukrainians have. And the problem the West has, it doesn't have the artillery tubes and the artillery shells to give to the Ukrainians. This is why we're giving the Ukrainians armored vehicles like tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, because we don't have the artillery to give them. But the problem is that tanks are not a good substitute for artillery, and we're not giving the Ukrainians that many tanks. So all this assistance from the West doesn't really add up to that much. What is needed here is artillery. One final point on this: there's talk now, as you know, about the West giving the Ukrainians fighter pilots. The West giving the Ukrainians fighter aircraft that their fighter pilots can use. This is not going to help much at all. First of all, it's going to take a long time.
What was the atmosphere in liberal circles around the Pinochet military coup? Did they deny that it happened at the time? I mean, without even looking at it, Old Dutch, like, and we can look at it actually, but I have no doubt, and I believe I've read segments like in Jakarta Method and other books like that where they talk about what the liberal media was saying, and there was a lot of stuff about Allende, obviously, fear-mongering about Allende's like overreach and these things like that. If I had to guess, if we looked at like the New York Times, for example, what they were saying about Allende and Pinochet, I'm sure it's going to be a lot of that kind of stuff. Talking about the economic consequences in Chile due to Allende's socialist policies while ignoring the role of the United States, playing in like, as Nixon talked about, making the economy scream, and directly and purposefully destroying their economy in order to get to that point. If I had to guess, that's what a lot of it would be there.
To train Ukrainian pilots to fly those F-16s or whatever Western planes are given to the Ukrainians. But the other thing is that the Russians have the most formidable air defenses in the world, especially
for sure the business
like
opportunities like CBC and Bolsonaro. Absolutely,
the Ukrainians get some.
It's going to be great for it's going to be great for the free market. The stocks are bumping. It's going to be great for investment. It's going to be great for mining companies. Probably a lot of that.
NATO aircraft.
If I had to guess.
It's just not going to matter much. The fact is that they need lots of artillery, and they don't have that. And the war is not going good at this point in time for the Ukrainians as a result.
Mm-hmm. John, you said that the West is deeply committed to the war and they cannot afford to lose. But I would say probably it's the same for the Russians. They can't afford to lose the war. It's about their existence as a nation. So what's the final game? And at the same time, we heard of the talk of nuclear war. The threat seems to be increasingly, I'm not sure it's real, but there's a threat of nuclear weapons.
Well, I think there's no question that both the Russians and the West are deeply committed to winning this war. But I think that the Russians are more deeply committed. I think for the Russians, victory is more important than it is for the West. From a Russian point of view, what's happening in Ukraine is clearly an existential threat. They view it as a threat to their survival, and they have every intention of making sure that they do not lose, and indeed that they win this war. So you have here two sides that are deeply committed to winning, and the Russians are more deeply committed than are the Americans. What this tells you is, number one, that it's hard to see how you can have any sort of diplomatic settlement to this war, because both...
Sorry, I found this piece here from the New York Times, September 22nd, 1975, entitled 2 Years of Pinochet. Just on this subject, little sidebar here. I can't read the whole thing because I don't pay for the Times, but it's interesting. It's very, the framing of it is very liberal journalism, very standard liberal journalism. Very interesting, kind of taking all their claims at face value and not really investigating any of it. From what I can read of this piece, I make sure I'm not muted or anything. No, I'm not. Okay, good. On the second anniversary of the putsch that brought him to power, President Augusto Pinochet announced a partial easing of Chile's state of siege. The tragedy is that the mental state of siege that afflicts the junta and dictates perpetuation of repression remains in full force. General Pinochet and his colleagues still see Chile as the top priority target of a worldwide communist conspiracy and are prone to regard all critics of their harsh rule as either agents or dupes of the Kremlin. Thus, after agreeing to a visit from the United Nations Human Rights Commission, the junta abruptly denied entry to the panel on grounds that its mission was part of a Soviet plot to unleash a guerrilla struggle in Chile. The cancellation drew an unusual and thoroughly justified public rebuke from the junta from the United States. After junta leaders had hinted for weeks that the second anniversary celebration would bring dramatic liberalization, General Pinochet delivered scanty fare. And I know it, junta. Am I mispronouncing another word? Thank you for focusing on what really matters here. Thank you, folks. Let's concentrate on what really is important in this subject. Junta. Okay, fine. Here's the article. I don't know if we need to. It's not even that long. But I mean, yeah, it's taking everything Pinochet says at face value and saying, "Oh yeah, there's repression, there's human rights violations going on," but they say that it's because of a Kremlin conspiracy, and that obviously is a very serious thing. Pretty sure it's junta. Thank you, John. I'm gonna say junta, just to really mess with people. It's a junta. You could just take feedback, make the correction, and keep moving, or you can focus on the fact of the feedback and snark about it. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to choose, go ahead and choose option B on that one. Making it your problem. That's what I'm going to do. Anyway, let's continue this video.
Both sides want to win, and it's impossible for both sides to win. This is why most people think this war is going to go on for a long time. Second, there is a possibility that the West and the Ukrainians will succeed in winning on the battlefield in Ukraine and pushing the Russians back. And it will then appear to the Russians like they are about to lose the war. In that instance, there is a non-trivial chance that the Russians will use nuclear weapons to rescue the situation. So one never wants to lose sight of the fact that there is always
one should not lose sight of
count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Thank you, Dimitri, for the gifted sub.
Will be used in this war. And it is most likely that they will be used if the Russians are losing. So we in the
Great
West
outcome.
are in
That
this
sounds great. Let's keep pushing for that.
situation where we are trying to defeat the Russians in Ukraine. But the more successful we are at achieving that goal, the more likely it is that nuclear weapons would be used. And that, of course, would be an unmitigated disaster. We do not want that to happen. All of this just tells you how much trouble we are in regarding this war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Of course, we used to know that there's a basic theory of mutually assured destruction. If one party uses these nuclear weapons, the other party could do the same. And then that's destruction for both sides.
Sounds great.
Is that still working as a deterrent against either side?
Somewhat, but you want to understand that there are two different scenarios where nuclear weapons can be used. One scenario is where the Russians use nuclear weapons against NATO. And in that instance, mutual assured destruction comes into play because obviously the West has nuclear weapons, the Russians have nuclear weapons, and there is a great danger in that situation that both sides would end up destroying each other. But the more relevant scenario at this point in time is where the Russians use nuclear weapons not against the West, but they use nuclear weapons in Ukraine against Ukrainian forces, and they use those nuclear weapons in a limited fashion. The Ukrainians do not have a nuclear arsenal of their own. So the Ukrainians cannot retaliate against Russia if Russia uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Therefore, mutual assured destruction does not apply in that scenario. And the Russians are likely to think that they can get away with using nuclear weapons. Now, one might say if the Russians use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, the West will then retaliate with its own nuclear weapons to defend Ukraine. I do not believe that will happen. And
just a mini
French
nuclear
President
Armageddon. That's
Macron
right.
has said that that would not happen. So in a very important way, the great danger here is that the Russians are losing on the battlefield in Ukraine, and they use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, thinking that the West will not respond with nuclear weapons, and therefore we can avoid a mad situation.
Well, in any sense, we are going to see the tension, the situation continue to escalate before, we see an end scenario, either a peaceful negotiation or and whatever pressure, due to probably both sides, they are tired of fighting, then there will be a pause or stop.
I'm not sure about that. You want to remember that World War I went on from 1914, from August 1914 until November 1918. And the number of people who were killed in World War I was very great. So it's not clear to me that this war will end anytime soon because the two sides.
Well, Dummy Dorco. I watched that film the other night, by the way, Donnie Darko. It was fun to revisit that with my teenage stepson. Good teenager movie. Let me just destroy the infrastructure of the territory I'm seeking to acquire, even from a real politics standpoint. I don't see the value. I think this is under the idea, though, that they're being defeated. Like this is like a last case scenario, or a worst case scenario
count on
for
me.
Russia.
You're gonna have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Slub to Rob.
Stu, thank you very much for the 24 months of Prime. And look at that, Stu, brand new, highly exclusive, highly elite, 24-month sub badge. Nice job, Stu. Welcome. Has nothing to do with piss. Very good soundtrack. That's right. So I think this is like a worst case scenario, rather than get pushed back and now deal with this officially fully integrated Western proxy state. This would be the I guess is the logic is that would be the response.
You can count on me. You're gonna have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Amazing Bird Show, thanks for the 22 months of Tier 1. Again, when you mention the word piss badge, the text-to-speech is not going to read your comment. So, by all means, let's keep doing that meme. I don't think it looks like piss or pee. The badge, frankly, I don't think it does. I think it's a golden kind of elite status symbol, personally. So, you by all means keep doing the meme, but the text-to-speech is not going to pick up your resub comments. It just represents destruction for the normal people living their day to day. Yeah, absolutely. And it would be a fucking calamity. How do I get a piss badge? Well, gone wrong. You have to subscribe to, first of all, there's no piss badge. There is no piss badge. It's golden. If your pee looks that color, then you're extremely dehydrated and you got to drink some more water. But what you got to do is subscribe to the channel, and it is the 24-month badge. So if you subscribe today, then in February 26, you'll get the badge. But you got to start somewhere, right? You got to start at the beginning. So yeah, frankly, Dummy Dorco, I kind of have a hard time believing that something on the table either. But I think the point of pointing it out, though, is the idea, pushing back on the idea that some kind of full military defeat for Russia in this case is like a good scenario for anybody. I think it's worth pointing out that they could go to those kind of lengths rather than give up that kind of defeat. For those of people that believe that that's the only possible outcome in this conflict, is to not only have like a stalemate, not have a dialogue or peace negotiations or change their territory, but push the Russians away. You can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
I forgot I canceled my Prime lol.
Gone wrong. Thanks for the 9 months of Tier 1. I appreciate it. So you're close. You're close. You got another year and a bit to go. Anyway, I guess that's why I kind of agree with what you're saying. Dummy Dorco. I hope that it's not a possibility either, but think it's worth pointing out to people that have this fixation on defeating the Russians that it is a distinct possibility. When you read 24 months, special knowledge is revealed, represented by the sunshine yellow. That's absolutely correct.
Fighting. Again, you want to remember that for the Russians, they believe they're facing an existential threat. And when you think you're facing an existential threat, you in effect fight to the death. And the West is furthermore deeply committed to this war. So it's hard to see the West quitting, especially since Western soldiers are not involved. If anybody is going to get battle weary and think about quitting, it's not the West, it's the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians, of course, view what's happening as an existential threat themselves. So the Ukrainians have a deep-seated interest in fighting to the death. So when you look carefully at this, it's very hard to see how it comes to an end unless the Russians begin to score major victories on the battlefield and the Ukrainian military collapses, or unless the Ukrainians begin to win on the battlefield and the Russians use nuclear weapons, in which case both sides would go to great lengths to shut the war down very quickly. But neither one of those two scenarios that lead to an end to the war look likely at this point in time. And what appears to be likely is that you're going to have a protracted war.
A protracted war. What about the effects of the war? Of course, we understand that there will be impact on the generations of the Ukrainians and the Russians, at least this generation. And of course, what about the effects on European countries? This is a war in the European continent, and the European countries are basically almost cutting their relationship with Russia. And what does the future be like?
Well, I think if you look at the consequences of this war for Europe, it's a very disturbing picture. I think that relations between Russia and Europe, and this includes not just Eastern Europe, but Western Europe, are now poisonous. Whereas the Russians and the Germans had had very good relations for decades, Russian-German relations are terrible. And there's no evidence that relations between Russia and the West are going to improve. And in fact, the Russians are going to have an incentive to cause all sorts of problems in Europe because they view the Europeans as their enemy.
Daka, dude, like what you're outlining there, I don't think this war will be drawn out more than a year. Biden's going to try to get a peace deal before the next election, try to make it look like it's not a loss. I think that's pretty in line with what our guest on the podcast this week, Eric Sperling, was saying. So I hope that's right. Like these been pointing out, just in terms of the actual battlefield stuff, it does seem to be winding towards kind of a stalemate. So it might be like, give another couple months effort. After that, it's time to make a deal and figure out what the country looks like afterwards. I don't envy the people that are going to be in the supposedly free democratic part of Ukraine afterwards, because it's going to be it's being completely remade and economically drained. It's going to be, I don't think, a very good situation for people that are left over there.
And the Europeans, of course, view the Russians as their enemy. So both sides are going to have all sorts of incentives to cause the other side trouble. And this means that it's hard to see how you're going to get a stable and peaceful Europe in the foreseeable future. Now, one very important element in the equation is whether or not you get a meaningful peace to end this conflict at some point in the not too distant future. I think it's more likely that you'll end up with a frozen conflict than with a meaningful peace treaty. So I think this conflict could lead to a situation where both sides stop shooting at each other, but the situation is not peaceful at all. And in fact, it looks a lot like the Cold Peace between North Korea and South Korea. And if that's the case, relations in Europe, stability in Europe, are going to be in terrible shape for the foreseeable future.
for decades probably. Not that long ago, you were at a debate about the solutions to the crisis. You talked about two alternatives. One is a neutral Ukraine. The other is to follow the Biden administration to double down on the sanctions on Russia. And tell us more about that, your choice in particular.
Well, I believe the only way out of this war.
I think you're forgetting, Rob, that no matter what the U.S. decides, the current leadership of Ukraine wants not just the Donbass back, but Crimea as well, whether the U.S. will back them up or not. That is the whole element, too, that they've empowered this, and this now heavily armed and highly trained Ukrainian nationalist element. And they might not be on board for any of these peace talks if Zelensky or whatever comes around to that. And if Zelensky probably does end up saying, okay, now we want to negotiate with Russia and end this thing, we will probably see something happen to him, frankly. I would not be surprised if that would spell the end for Zelensky. So there's that as well. Even if America is ready to pull the plug on this thing, they may have kind of created a monster here that is not just going to say, that is just going to continue regardless of what the State Department tells them to do. I think that's a distinct possibility as well. Their demands are intentionally unacceptable to Russia. Well, any negotiation that starts with Russia giving back territory that's taken during this war, let alone Crimea, is just a total non-starter. That's just not ever going to happen. So, you would hope that people maybe understood this basic idea. Is one of the things I don't really understand about these these Ukrainian nationalists. It's they don't seem to really consider the people that live in this region to be part of their culture or their country anyways. These ethnic Russians that live in the East, obviously they haven't been included in this sort of Ukrainian nationalist project that's been kind of cemented since 2014. So what's the big fucking deal? Why are they willing to risk everything to hold on to these regions? They don't even seem to really like the people that live there in the first place.
Use the computer to mark up the size of the account.
A nation of armed fascists hungering for more wars. A welcomed blowback to the U.S. bourgeoisie.
That's right, Dimitri. And I fucking swear, thank you for the 200 friend coin, by the way, but I fucking swear, when we get to the point that these heavily armed and highly trained right-wing fascists, nationalists that we've been supporting endlessly for the last year, when there's eventually the real blowback starts from these people, and when eventually America is starting to have to fight them, lo and behold, I fucking swear we're going to be getting lectured by all the exact same people that supported this, who denied that this was going to be the result. And all these people are going to throw their hands up in the air and be like, whoa, we had nothing to do with this. They're going to deny their role in perpetuating that exact situation. I know that it's going to happen already. I can see it coming in the future, and I'm already being driven insane with anger over it. These very same people are going to be like, well, I never supported this. Meanwhile, when it was happening, and when folks like you and I and people in this community and a few small other communities that have been raising these questions, we're getting screamed at as being genocide deniers and Putin sympathizers or whatever, while trying to avoid that exact outcome. And all the people that supported it are going to be like, well, we had nothing to do with this. I can see it coming already. And in fact, many of them are going to fail upwards to become even more prominent media figures. If that happens, how long do you think before it starts? I would say, like we're saying, there's an element of these Ukrainian nationalists that are not going to accept any peace deal. They view this as a fundamental ideological struggle. So I think when this moment comes, when the U.S. starts pulling the plug on this and they start trying to promote the idea of de-escalation and dialogue and maybe some territory changing hands, who knows what the reaction is going to be from these militant groups that have been, armed to the teeth and highly trained by the CIA and Canadian and British intelligence, whoever else. We'll see how they're going to react to this idea of having a peace. I don't think they're going to react too well to it. Especially, again, if they get the sense that America and NATO is abandoning them. Right? Biden's in Ukraine going right now is still saying no, we're in it to the end. We're in it to win it. he's still saying that. And part of the reason that he's using that rhetoric is because he doesn't want these people to think that America's ready to fucking pull the plug. But if these people have a chip on their shoulder towards both Russia and then also towards NATO and the United States for pulling out and allowing those territories to fall into Russian hands, who knows how they're going to react to that. At least a decent number of the well-trained fascists are dead now, but it's become this, it's like a training territory, for however many of these militia members are killed in these battles. Like, they're just they're radicalizing more people and pulling more people into their movement from it. So I don't know. Well, we'll see if they do move towards negotiation and settlement, how these right-wing elements react. I don't think they're going to react too well.
And the only way to create any semblance of stability in Europe is for Ukraine to become a neutral state, for Ukraine to give up its aspirations to become part of the West, to give up on its aspirations to become a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. The Russians will accept nothing less. So if we want to end this conflict, we have to move to neutrality. A neutral Ukraine. But there's no evidence that's going to happen. It's unacceptable to the Americans.
I think I think the difference is, I think it might end up being acceptable to the Americans, but it's not going to be acceptable to these nationalists.
And this is why you see so much escalation in this conflict. The Americans are looking for ways to defeat the Russians.
You know what really sets me off? The libs calling the idea of peace talks appeasement. That's what we can expect nothing less from the dronies.
What the Americans are trying to do is
that's why they're the dronies.
Knock the Russians out of the
They just want more death, more violence, more escalation.
This, of course, is why, from Russia's point of view, what the West is doing represents an existential threat. And we do more and more every week to up the ante. And all this does is cause the Russians to do more and more to up the ante. So both sides are upping the ante more and more each week. You have this spiral mechanism at play. And in no way is this likely to lead to a neutral Ukraine, which again is the only way out of this crisis.
They've been pushing the Hitler thing so hard. They think they're reliving World War II, and if they negotiate anything with Putler, he's going to betray it. That's right. He's going to conquer Europe.
And therefore, it doesn't look
if
like
you appease Putler and you have peace deals, then Putler's going to conquer Europe. That's what they're saying.
We are moving to a multipolar world, and of course, with Russia basically defying the U.S. will and the rise of the rest. Let's say, if you look at the global South, China, India, South America, Brazil, basically countries in the developing world.
Putin's going to get the Infinity Stones.
The Western countries to impose sanctions on Russia, and then they refuse to take sides on the war. And so they are choosing a neutral status in terms of the Ukraine conflict. Do you see there's a rise of a multipolar world? If that's the case, what's the impact of the war on the global order?
I think there's no question that we are in a multipolar
world. I agree with what you're saying there, Omega on the thing.
Multipolar
That's the kind of
since roughly 2017. And when I say we're in a multipolar world, I believe there are three great powers on the planet: the United States, China, and Russia. I believe Russia is the weakest of those three great powers. And I believe that China is a peer competitor to the United States. One does not want to underestimate how powerful China is and how much potential power it has. And this is why the United States has long been interested in pivoting to Asia. So you have three great powers at play in the system. We are in a multipolar world. Unipolarity is behind us. Now,
thank you, Lee was Kangs 1235.
What's happened
couldn't
here
agree more.
is
Thank
that,
you.
America's ability to win friends around the world has diminished. It's really quite remarkable. there's no question that in the West, relations between the United States and its European allies and relations between the United States and Japan and South Korea have improved as a result of the Ukraine war. And the West looks more united than ever. But given what the United States is doing in Ukraine, it's quite clear that outside of the West, most countries are not sympathetic to the United States at all. And in fact, they're reasonably, if not very, hostile to the United States. I think the best,
like I've been saying yesterday, that's why one of the most illuminating ways to understand these events is just simply to pay attention to what people in the formerly colonized world are saying about it. You know? It's one thing people have refused to do. Just pay attention to what people in the global south are saying. They're able to analyze these big global events because they're very familiar with what Western imperialism looks like and what the role the United States plays in these kinds of conflicts. Like it's giving them the benefit of the doubt, right? People in the global south are not going to give the United States the benefit of the doubt. Why would they? There's generations of history and evidence that they can point to about what the United States values really are. And they obviously don't believe all this high-minded rhetoric about the United States being protectors of democracy and freedom and stuff like that. People in the global south know that's bullshit, you know? But still, when we live in the empire, it seems really difficult for people to let go of this idea. That's been so valuable, just simply paying attention to what people in the global south are saying about this. Like, do you think maybe these formerly colonized countries have a understanding of these big events, or do you think they're all Putin propagandists? Ask yourself this question.
Best example of this is India. Before the Ukraine war, it looked like India and the United States were going to join together to form a quite tight balancing coalition against China. But once the Ukraine war broke out, given the history of good relations between Russia and India, the Indians have been very reluctant to side with the United States in any meaningful way against Russia. And indeed, one could argue that the Indians are siding with the Russians against the Americans over the Ukraine war. This has ramifications for the United States' ability to contain China, because India was supposed to be a key player in the balancing coalition against China.
They all know, so even India and Saudi Arabia, they know which way the wind is blowing here.
War, what you see is that outside the West, the United States is not doing very well in terms of winning influence and getting countries to line up on its side against China.
Well, you said the U.S. is not doing that well in winning friends. What happened, because the Trump administration certainly is gone, and we have the Joe Biden administration here.
Well, the fact is that the Biden administration is, I think, on balance, somewhat more aggressive and somewhat more hawkish than the Trump administration was. Donald Trump, for all his faults, was not a warmonger. Donald Trump did not start any wars.
This is kind of bullshit from Mearsheimer, this whole thing about Donald Trump not being a warmonger, considering the ways that under Trump, not starting new wars, still dramatically escalated the drone assassination program, although he committed to a timeline to getting out of Afghanistan, bombed the fuck out of Afghanistan. It's not like Trump reined in the security state in any meaningful way. And he would use rhetoric and stuff about getting out of NATO, which he never followed through on. Ukraine continued to get armed under Trump as well, partially because he was under so much pressure because of the Russiagate stuff that he apparently, I think, felt that he needed to be as antagonistic as possible towards Russia. So, yeah, you don't think we have killers? But while that's a Trump moment that I appreciated his candor, because he was absolutely correct. This idea that he was not starting new wars, he was not being a warmonger, I don't think there's really any truth to that, considering the ways all the existing security state institutions that were there, he expanded them all. And just look at the warmongers he put in his administration. I think that's a bit of cope from our friend Mearsheimer. Literally assassinated an Iranian official. I mean, what the fuck was that? And then the only reason that didn't start a war is because Iran is not stupid enough to rise to the bait. But that very well could have started a war. So that's a Mearsheimer L to me.
He makes the argument, and it may be true, that if he were the president instead of Joe Biden, that there would be no war in Ukraine.
No, I don't think that's true.
You never know for sure whether that's true. But it does get at the point that Trump was certainly hawkish towards China, and he was certainly interested in containing China. There's no question about that.
It's what the conservative sect of the security institutions want.
Not remarkably hawkish.
Separate China and Russia.
Joe Biden, on the other hand, is hawkish across the board. He is very interested in pursuing an aggressive foreign policy. And by the way, if you look at American policy on Ukraine from January 2021,
Copenhagen will still run as the anti-war candidate, and it'll play well for him. He has a statement to this effect coming out right now.
February of 2022. What you see
can take a look at it next.
Is that Joe Biden was becoming much more aggressive on the Ukraine issue than Trump had been. And it was Biden's aggressiveness on the Ukraine issue that played a key role in leading to the war breaking out on February 24th of last year. So you do not want to underestimate how aggressive Biden was toward Russia on the Ukraine issue. And of course, he's been every bit as aggressive towards China, if not more aggressive toward China, than his predecessor, Donald
John,
Trump
if you're
was.
not, then Republicans will say that you're a Chinese puppet, so he has to prove them
even
wrong.
Though Trump is gone, the United States has not become less aggressive on the foreign policy front.
Mm-hmm. What about Russia, John? Russia, obviously, they are having probably less and less relationship with the European countries, which they previously enjoy a lot in terms of trade. But now they are turning to Asian countries, for example.
Wants to promote aggression without saying aggression. That's
so
right.
in a couple of years, now they are quite weak economically because of the sanctions. What about, in 3 years' time or in 5 years' time? Are their relationship with China, India, other Asian countries going to, replace or at least fill this the empty room, left probably in their relationship with the European countries?
I think that has to happen. It's hard to imagine trade relations between Russia and Europe going back to what they were before the war broke out. And that's especially true of German-Russian relations. It is possible that those trade relations will improve somewhat in the distant future, but I think it's going to take a long time for that to happen. And in the meantime, the Russians have very powerful incentives to replace their trade relations, their lost trade relations in Europe with increased trade relations with countries like India and countries like China and countries in places like Africa. And you see much evidence of that already happening, and I think you'll see more of it moving forward. There's a great deal of talk in the West about the fact that sanctions have failed. There's no doubt that sanctions have hurt the Russian economy somewhat, but not very much, nowhere near as much as people expected. And one of the reasons for that is that the Russians have been able to replace their trade relations or their
all outcomes have been considered
with trade with other countries, to include China and India.
The latest news being that the U.S. bombed this Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Will that have any effect on Washington's relationship with Brussels?
I don't think so. I think the key question is whether or not it will have an effect on U.S.-German relations, because Nord Stream belonged to the Germans and the Russians, not to Brussels. And the question is, what will the Germans do? It's difficult to say for sure, but my guess is
We're still buying Russian gas through India. We don't abide by our own sanctions. That's the beauty of the rules-based international order, though, Bird Show, right? It's like they decide who's part of it. They decide what the rules are. They decide who has to follow the rules and who doesn't. It's basically just it's like that show Whose Line Is It Anyway? They just get to make it up as they go along.
is that the Germans will complain somewhat, but in the end, the Germans will not complain too much, because the Germans are in good part subservient to the Americans. The Americans basically call the shots in Europe. And when you're involved in a war over Ukraine and the Germans are allied with the United States against Ukraine, and when the United States provides security for Germany, you have a situation where there are real limits to what the Germans can do in terms of complaining about the whole Nord Stream experience. So I don't think it's going to matter that much in the end.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, we conclude today's show. Many thanks to Professor John J. Mearsheimer. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube.
There we go. There's John Mearsheimer. The Nord Stream experience. I like that. Germany is still occupied by the U.S. with almost 20 military bases. Is Germany even allowed to militarize? That's right. You were saying that earlier, Kara. That's why you can bomb their infrastructure. What are they going to do about it? What are you going to do, Germany? We're still militarily occupying you. If we tell you to pay higher costs for energy, you're going to pay higher costs. That's the price of having the good old US of A in there to protect you. What channel was that? That was CGTN. It's the Chinese state media, which is significantly better than a lot of Western coverage of any of these events, despite being framed as being evil and nefarious because it's partially financed by the Chinese government. They do a lot of propaganda by saying true things, which is very upsetting to some Americans. Before I move on, I'm just going to run a brief ad. Again, I don't really do a lot of ads, ad breaks on the show. I've never really wanted to have that. I may have to at some point to increase the income, but I try to avoid it. But I do have a special ad that describes what this community is about. So we're going to continue on with this discussion and this discourse for another hour or so. But please, if you enjoy the content, if it's your first time tuning in, if you're a lurker, or if you're a dedicated elite community member, please subscribe to TRRS for $5 per month, or totally free of charge. If you have a Twitch Prime account, an Amazon Prime account, you can convert that to a free of charge subscription to this program if you want to. And every little bit helps. It helps keep this content on the air. It allows me to keep doing this show every single day right here on Twitch. So please subscribe to TRRS. And if you don't know what TRRS is or what the Friendship Triangle system is about, I'm just going to run this very brief ad so you can see what it is. And you'll see that it's nothing nefarious, and it's not a psyop, nor is it a cult, or it's certainly not a pyramid scheme. Here we go.
Thank you for expressing interest in the Friendship Triangle community. We would be thrilled to have you on board as a member of our exclusive platform. As you may know, the Friendship Triangle is Twitch's only two-dimensional, triangle-shaped, friendship access and trickle-down cloud tiered reward system. Today you have an amazing opportunity to join the base level of the Friendship Triangle system. Once you are part of the community, you'll have the ability to rise through the ranks and achieve higher levels of access and rewards. One way to do this is by gifting subscriptions to your fellow members or by inviting your friends and family members to join our community. As you ascend the tiers, you will be exposed to a range of new and exciting benefits, such as exclusive content, advanced features, and access to our elite community members. We are confident that you will enjoy all the perks that come with being part of the Friendship Triangle. However, we also want to remind you that not all friends and family members are to be trusted, especially those who may not support your new lifestyle. That's why we encourage you to focus on building meaningful relationships within our community, where you will find like-minded individuals who share your interests and values. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to our team. We are always here to support our members and ensure that your experience with the Friendship Triangle is enjoyable. We're glad that you are considering joining the Friendship Triangle community. We look forward to seeing you rise through the Chaos Zone and all the way into the Elite tier. It's not a cult.
It says it right there. Thank you so much, Gen X Bushy, for the 5 gifted subs. Gen X Bushy, you really come through a lot to support this channel, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you, Ben, as well, for the gifted sub. Thanks, Ben. Very much appreciated. That's right, I got my Fighting Momo shirt on today. As part of my mandatory TRRS merch. I do have, like, I was mentioning this before, I do have, like, unofficial TRRS tracksuits now. I've got 3 different colors of TRRS tracksuits with my hoodies.
You can count on me. You're gonna have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
I have different colored track pants, and I match them with my hoodies. So I have a gray version, a black version, and a blue version. It's pretty sick. Yeah, there's not official ones. These are unofficial, but I encourage others to mix and match like this. You can have your official TRRS jumpsuit. How about some running shorts? Well, we're not quite there temperature-wise. It's very chilly right now still. Obviously, in the summer, I'm going to go back to the shorts, the little shorts, as you all know. And thank you, GMO Radio, for the gifted sub as well. Thank you, GMO Radio. Yeah, you just have to buy track pants or jogging pants that coincide with the color of the TRRS hoodie that you happen to have. I live nowhere near any snow, so it stays warm. I wish I didn't live near snow. I hate it. It's so cold right now, my body is just starting to miss breaking down. It gets really cold, and it has really bad impacts on my body. Like, I can barely... You should see me try to walk down the stairs right now, folks. Seriously, it's like... I look like a 75-year-old man. Like, I got to go down one step at a time. I'm like... You know? It's really not good. It's really not a good situation. I'm just going to loop this for a few minutes. Try to see if we can do a little more business. And then we will move on. I've got a few more things to talk about. I'm pretty tired, so I don't want to stay too long here. One of the few times where it is appropriate to say, come to Brazil. I would love to. And bro, I'd be happy to. Come to Brazil. Ja. Don't you mean? I would be thrilled. I would love to. I don't have any stairs to contend with, so that's a plus. I just look like shit. Gen X Bushy. Absolutely. Shout out to Stalinist Grandpa. One of the beloved side characters of the program, along with the Stalinist Babushka, which you can access with the TRRS Babushka command. One of the exclusive emotes that we have on this platform, if you subscribe to the channel. And then you can use Stalinist Babushka in other Twitch chats. Doesn't that sound nice? Doesn't that sound fun? You could get one of those Glenn Greenwald setups. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? That'd be nice. Learning Portuguese seems tricky, though. Portuguese seems like a tricky language. Oh. I'm just going to take a brief time out here, folks, 5 minutes just to sit up. Just sit up, stretch my legs a little bit. I'm getting a little bit of a sore rear end type situation right now, so don't go anywhere. I'm going to let the ad run a little bit. Again, if you want to subscribe to the channel, I would appreciate it a lot. It's very helpful. I'm going to let the video run one more time, maybe 2 more times. I'll sit back down. We'll get into some more discourse, some more stuff to look at, and we'll have more important discussions. Okay? I'll be right back.
Expressing interest in the Friendship Triangle community. We would be thrilled to have you on board as a member of our exclusive platform. As you may know, the Friendship Triangle is Twitch's only two-dimensional, triangle-shaped, friendship access and trickle-down cloud tiered reward system. Today you have an amazing opportunity to join the base level of the Friendship Triangle system. Once you are part of the community, you'll have the ability to rise through the ranks and achieve higher levels of access and rewards. One way to do this is by gifting subscriptions to your fellow members or by inviting your friends and family members to join our community. As you ascend the tiers, you will be exposed to a range of new and exciting benefits, such as exclusive content, advanced features, and access to our elite community members. We are confident that you will enjoy all the perks that come with being part of the Friendship Triangle. However, we also want to remind you that not all friends and family members are to be trusted, especially those who may not support your new lifestyle. That's why we encourage you to focus on building meaningful relationships within our community, where you will find like-minded individuals who share your interests and values. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to our team. We are always here to support our members and ensure that your experience with the Friendship Triangle is enjoyable. We're glad that you are considering joining the Friendship Triangle community. We look forward to seeing you rise through the Chaos Zone and all the way into the Elite tier. It's not a cult. Thank you for expressing interest in the Friendship Triangle community. We would be thrilled to have you on board as a member of our exclusive platform. As you may know, the Friendship Triangle is Twitch's only two-dimensional, triangle-shaped, friendship access and trickle-down cloud tiered reward system. Today you have an amazing opportunity to join the base level of the Friendship Triangle system. Once you are part of the community, you'll have the ability to rise through the ranks and achieve higher levels of access and rewards. One way to do this is by gifting subscriptions to your fellow members or by inviting your friends and family members to join our community. As you ascend the tiers, you will be exposed to a range of new and exciting benefits, such as exclusive content, advanced features, and access to our elite community members. We are confident that you will enjoy all the perks that come with being part of the Friendship Triangle. However, we also want to remind you that not all friends and family members are to be trusted, especially those who may not support your new lifestyle. That's why we encourage you to focus on building meaningful relationships within our community, where you will find like-minded individuals who share your interests and values. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to our team. We are always here to support our members and ensure that your experience with the Friendship Triangle is enjoyable. We're glad that you are considering joining the Friendship Triangle community. We look forward to seeing you rise through the Chaos Zone and all the way into the Elite tier. It's not a cult.
Okay, I'm back. What's up? I've never, like, in my life connected with a plant. I've never been like a plant guy. I've never been good at like keeping up with watering plants or like doing any of that stuff. But I have this fern. In here, which I think is the first plant that I've like connected with. The first plant that it's like I feel kind of an obligation to. So like this is like a living thing that I need to keep alive. I'm starting to take a certain amount of pride in ensuring that my fern is being taken care of properly. It was starting to look kind of ugly a couple months ago. Had some like dead branches and was like shedding a lot of leaves on the floor, and I was getting kind of depressed about it, but I did take the time a couple weeks ago to like trim it a little bit, trim all the dead leaves off and trim some of the branches. And I've been more determined than ever since then to continue like, you know, making sure it's got enough water, making sure it's getting that sunlight. Bro, what you got to get is an inside tree. Buy me one of those tiny Norfolk pines on discount after Christmas, and it's my sweet baby now. That sounds nice. I do have a plant here on my desk it is looking a little worse for wear. Maybe that could be my next option. Inside trees. Interesting. I'm actually going to give this a little... It doesn't get enough light, the one that's on my desk. What's an inside tree? Like one of these guys? Just bring one of these in my apartment. Is this what you were referring to? I think this may be a little more than what I was hoping for, frankly. This might be a little bit more responsibility that I'm willing to take on. Yeah, the superintendent would be fine with this, I think. Just carving a big hole in the ground. Like this? Do you mean like a bonsai tree, or do you mean like one of these guys? LED plant lights are cheap and you could put a timer on them to be on when you're asleep. Oh, that's interesting. That is interesting. You gotta build a house around a tree. It'll change your life. Yeah. We'll see. Anyway, I'd like to get to what else that I wanted to talk about here. You know, going back to this like kind of new Cold War stuff, and you know we're focusing on Russia, Ukraine a lot for the first part of the show, but I mean,
You can count on me. You're gonna have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Diego, thank you for another gifted sub. Thank you. I really appreciate that. You know, we've been talking about Russia and Ukraine a lot, which obviously isn't a Cold War, but if you view the kind of great power conflict that's going on right now between Russia and the NATO countries and China, it's a hot front in this kind of Cold War between the West and Russia. And I think talking about, you know, what China has been doing lately, which I think is kind of interesting and unprecedented. We mentioned how they're getting more directly involved in the trying to negotiate some kind of settlement or peace there, despite that being framed as them helping Russia in the media. But I think one really interesting thing that's happened is China does seem to be getting kind of tired of our shit. And they're starting to, I think, turn up the temperature on some of the rhetoric they're willing to use, talking about the United States and talking about the role that the West is playing in these affairs. Their stance, as always, remains the kind of stance of like non-interference, even to the point that I think some of us would like to see more interference. But they are starting to like heavily push back, when we frame them as being the aggressive country, based on the spy balloon stuff, when we frame them as being the human rights abusers and we're the defenders of human rights. I think they're a little bit fed up with this nonstop fucking bullshit. And the way that we talk about them and the way that we've been the confrontational and aggressive power in this kind of Cold War. They seem to be a little tired of it. And that's reflected, I think, in the rhetoric that they're starting to use. I want to look at this talk from Wang Yi. Which is right. Okay, so there's Wang Yi here. Let's watch that. The Cold War mentality is back.
Safer. Trust but the world is not yet safer. Trust between major countries is lacking. Geopolitical rifts are widening. Unilateralism is rampant. The Cold War mentality is back. New types of security threats from energy, food, climate, biosecurity, and artificial intelligence keep emerging.
And they're obviously meeting with. They're talking about there's partnership with Russia that's forming. Okay, that's not very helpful, but saying that Beijing will strengthen its economic and strategic cooperation with Russia. And I wanted to look at this clip as well from China Foreign Ministry spokesman Wen Bin as just another example of how they're kind of ratcheting up this rhetoric a little bit. They're not kind of taking this kind of shit anymore. We saw a lot as well, like we covered this on the show when it was going on, but all the accusations from Canada over China's like human rights abuses, or alleged human rights abuses or genocide, as Canada was referring to them. And we saw that was a particular sticking point for them, and they took a certain amount of interest in, I think, aggressively pushing back on that, and also talking about our own genocidal past and the complete lack of a leg to stand on when it comes to Canada or any of these other colonial countries, settler colonialist countries, wagging our fingers at them and accusing them of genocide or ethnic cleansing or any of these things. So we saw that, and then I saw this the other day as well, or earlier today. What is really worrying is the destructive influence of the United States on world peace and stability. America is the largest producer of war. The United States has not fought in just 16 years of its 240-year history. The United States has initiated about 80% of armed conflicts in the world since the end of World War II. The United States violates the sovereignty of other countries the most and interferes in the internal affairs of other countries. After the end of World War II... Hold on, I was trying to turn down the volume. After the end of World War II, the United States tried to overthrow more than 50 foreign governments, violently interfered in elections in at least 30 countries, and tried to kill more than 50 foreign leaders. The U.S. is still the largest source of confrontation between the camps. And yeah, so it's like that CM Punk clip from AEW. Stop me when I'm telling lies. Stop me when I'm telling lies. Again, and people were reacting to this like, oh, how are they... It's beneath them to regurgitate this kind of like terrible propaganda, literally just saying true things about what the United States has done throughout the world. I see a lot of libs thinking that India will be the better ally, even though they'll use their big population as bargaining chip. In the moment they grow to China level of wealth, they'll look more and more for their interests, which is good. And that's true. And that's what we're seeing from India right now, as India, despite being a very reactionary country in terms of the government that's there now, and a pretty reliable Western partner. But have refused to back them on this. And I'm sure as India does try to carve out its own path, it will become more of a target. But when you're talking about, India and China, and why people view India as being a better ally, like you're saying, part of that reason is because India has gone down the economic path that's been kind of dictated to them from the United States, whereas China has tried to carve this different path, creating socialism with Chinese characteristics, etc. And like we've talked about before as well, if you want to look at this, the reason why I wouldn't refer to China as a capitalist country, despite it leaning on and using the capitalist mode of production, is you just look at how these two countries have developed. Very kind of similar circumstances in the post-war period. Look at the development that's happened in China versus what's happened in India. And where would you rather be as like a person without a lot of, like as a poor person? What situation would you rather be in? It seems pretty clear that they've developed in completely different trajectories. Yeah, we think it competitive in the tech sector. That's right. Anyway, let's continue this. So he said, the U.S. is still the largest source of confrontation between the camps. NATO's wars against Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria under the leadership of the United States have resulted in the deaths of more than 900,000 people and 37 million refugees. As long as America's hegemonic policies and belligerent tendencies continue, there will be no peace in the world. And again, these are all just factual statements about what the role the United States has played throughout the world. And I kind of wanted to, I don't know if this is going to be too much reading, but I kind of wanted to take a look at this. We briefly mentioned this yesterday. This, I don't know if this is a white paper, but this paper that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the PRC just put out called the U.S. Hegemony and Its Perils. And I think this really, like we're seeing, there does seem to be like there's been a significant shift in the way that China is choosing to engage with the West and engaging and talking about America. And as much as like the U.S. ambassador tries to frame it as being propaganda, what did he say? Crude propaganda and unworthy of a great power. The United States remains ready for meaningful cooperation to tackle shared global challenges. No one believes this. Like that's the thing that's changing right now. No one believes this anymore. No one has to pretend to believe it. Maybe countries in this rules-based international order still believe this. No one around the world does, though. Russia doesn't, certainly. China doesn't. And people in the global south, they're very aware that America does not remain ready for meaningful cooperation to tackle shared global challenges. Everyone knows that that's not what America's policy is. Everyone knows that's not what America is about. And a lot of these countries, now that China especially is developing the level of kind of global influence that they feel comfortable making these statements, a lot of countries are, I think, becoming less and less afraid of the consequences of pointing these things out. This is pretty short. Oh man, actually it's not. I don't know if I can read this whole thing. I think maybe in other days I would have the energy to read this entire paper. It's not that long. I'm kind of running on empty here though right now. I should put it through an AI. Is there a Chrome setting about that? There is Ben's video. It's 30 minutes long. Let's actually do that. Let's look at, rather than me reading this entire report to you on camera. Let's look at Ben Norton's summary of this.
The new Cold War.
I think it's a little bit better for me. That works a little bit better for me. Let this guy do all the work. Let Ben Norton do all the work here. Let's hear from Benjamin Norton, friend of the stream.
That the United States is waging on China escalates more and more by the week. There are several ways in which Washington is waging this new Cold War. First and foremost is the economic war, which is also related to a technological war. The U.S. has imposed several rounds of sanctions on China. They started with the Donald Trump administration, and the Joe Biden administration has only continued imposing more sanctions. Recently, the U.S. imposed sanctions banning China from importing Western chip technology and semiconductors. And
I wonder what small countries should do in this Cold War. It's hard not to pick a side. If there was some non-aligned movement, it might be a good option. Well, that's the thing. I think, like we saw with Russia and Ukraine, most countries have remained neutral. But like I've been talking about on the show, I mentioned this to Vijay Prashad the other day when he was on the show, like the United States is not going to accept neutrality, right? Even if countries tried to say like, hey, we don't want to pick a side. We just want multilateralism. That's all. We just want the freedom to make multilateral agreements with one another, trade deals and deals to, like, you know, give access to our resources in exchange for infrastructure. We just want the freedom to be able to do that, which I think is a totally reasonable thing. But it's, according to the United States, they view that inherently as being like antagonistic and violent towards them. So I don't doubt that most countries would rather remain neutral and just would rather have this peaceful bilateral coexistence. But the United States is not going to allow that to happen. Yeah, what happened to the last non-aligned movement? That's exactly right. They were crushed with ruthless violence and subversion and, completely decimated. So it's a nice idea, but unfortunately, that's not something the United States, they've indicated this repeatedly throughout history that they're not going to tolerate that.
Quantum computing parts. And this is aimed at trying to sabotage China's tech sector. And of course, there are sanctions on Huawei and other Chinese tech companies. But another significant part of this new Cold War is the information war. And that's where we see constantly, day in, day out, information warfare waged by the US against China, using the media to spread ridiculous claims. I don't even need to go through them. We've all heard them. The ridiculous narratives and propaganda and fake stories that the US has been spreading to try to demonize China on the international stage. Well, Beijing is punching back. For a while, it was simply just enduring these constant attacks by the US. And this February, the Chinese government published a report that details many of the crimes committed by the US empire around the world. It is devastating. And I just want to go through some of the main points of this report. I will link to it in the description below so anyone can check it out for themselves. The document is called US Hegemony and Its Perils. This is one of the most thorough critiques of US imperialism I've seen in a long time. China condemns the war crimes committed by the United States, pointing out that millions of refugees have been, tens of millions of refugees have been created by the US wars since 2001.
37 million refugees. Like, again, I bring this up every time this subject comes up. Staggering. Like, even talking about all the people that have been killed in the wars and invasions and drone strikes, etc. You know? But 37 million refugees on top of that. Like, it's just a stunning, staggering number of people. Just a monstrous crime. You know? It's unfathomable to think about.
Hundreds of thousands of civilians have been killed in a conservative estimate. Millions of civilians have been wounded. It points out that the U.S. has committed ethnic cleansing and genocide against native peoples, that the U.S. has 800 foreign military bases.
That was in the past.
The U.S. has carried out 400 foreign military interventions, that the U.S. has organized coups around the world and regime change operations and so-called color revolutions. It's all in here. It is a devastating report, and it was released on February 20th. Now, one of the reasons
it's also been interesting learning how hyped Malcolm X was about the Bandung Conference. Now he wanted to create like a civil rights version of that in the U.S. And that's why you gotta, that's the Kill Bill sirens start going off when you have people domestically and internationally starting to talk like that. That's no good. That's a red line for the fucking psychos, the imperialists that control the United States of America. Can't have that. Can't have people talking like that.
I also want to go through this is that if you
There's Australian veteran bragging on Instagram about how he and his mates were killing Afghans. He was even going on podcasts. I mean, there was that horrific trial against the Australian soldiers that were for that exact reason. I saw some of the video of it. It's fucking depraved, and I don't doubt it's only scratching the surface of some of the depravity and violence that Australia and Canada and the United States were participating in. Just like shooting fucking farmers, unarmed farmers. Disgusting.
Saw it when this was mentioned in West
Give us
Virginia.
another try as
They
world
portrayed this
power. We
as
deserve a new
propaganda.
chance.
But the reality is that what the Chinese foreign ministry in this report is saying, these are facts. And of course, the West might not like
Yes,
that
they
China
are
is saying these facts, but these are facts. And around the world, outside of the West, outside the little bubble of the West, everyone knows that the U.S. has committed and continues to commit these crimes. So maybe it's seen as controversial in the global North, but in the global South, everyone's saying, yeah, we've been repeating this for a long time. We know what the U.S. has been doing around the world. So the way this report from the Chinese Foreign Ministry is organized is it's all about U.S. hegemony, and it's divided into 5 parts: political hegemony, military hegemony, economic hegemony, technological hegemony, and cultural hegemony. And essentially, this is China spelling out how the U.S. empire waged.
This is really interesting that they're doing this. I don't think we should understate how important this is.
Tools in its imperial toolbox.
Like,
So
this is
it
really
begins
an
pointing out with a
escalation in
very
terms of their
brief
rhetoric
history
here.
of the modern U.S. empire.
And I
that
love how they
since
just give this
the
like
end of World War
paper.
II, and especially after the end of the First Cold War,
They brought the
quote, the
receipts.
United States has acted more boldly to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, pursue, maintain, and abuse hegemony, advance subversion and infiltration, and willfully wage wars, bringing harm to the international community. Now, I guess I should point out for people who don't know what hegemony
I
is.
agree, dummy.
Hegemony is dominance. And especially in the political context, it is a state using its political and economic power to impose its will on the world, its dominance. And its imperialism is what China is describing. And they continue saying, the United States has developed a hegemonic playbook to stage color revolutions, which are regime change operations. We'll talk about that more in a second.
Like the Maidan,
Instigate
Euromaidan.
regional disputes, and even directly launch wars under the guise of promoting democracy, freedom, and human rights. Clinging to the Cold War mentality, the United States has ramped up bloc politics and stoked conflict and confrontation. It has overstretched the concept of national security, abused export controls, and forced unilateral sanctions upon others. It has taken a selective approach to international law and rules, utilizing or discarding them as it sees fit, and has sought to impose rules that serve its own interests in the name
Absolutely,
of
Jack
upholding
Ross.
a,
It's very
quote,
unfair.
rules-based international
It's very
order.
mean
Of course,
that
one
they
in which
bring up
the
things
US
that we've
makes
said
rules
and done.
and orders everyone around. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry, which published this report, says that its goal is to
We've
draw
moved on from
greater
all that
international
stuff.
attention to the perils of the U.S. practices to world peace and stability and the well-being of all people. So just at the beginning, going all out and saying that the U.S. is hurting the entire world. It's
Ben
preventing
loves
peace.
this.
The U.S. is interfering constantly in the affairs of foreign countries. All things that, again, are facts. This is not Chinese propaganda. These are facts. So let's briefly.
And I'm sorry, just a brief fuck you to all the people that have come for Ben, or it became fashionable to go after Ben, whatever. You know, shitty people. Ben does really valuable work on this, and you can see how much he's enjoying seeing China completely hammer the U.S. on all these very factual historical truths. The document goes very hard, yeah. Ben's taken shit from the patriotic socialists. He's taken shit from the liberals. He's taken shit from the dirtbag leftists. For some reason, it just became fashionable to go after him.
All things that, again, are facts. This is not Chinese propaganda. These are facts. So let's briefly summarize here the first part, which is about political hegemony. And it notes that the U.S. has interfered in the internal affairs of countless countries around the world and done so in the name of so-called promoting democracy, right? So it talks about Latin America, the so-called Monroe Doctrine. This year, 2023, is the 200th anniversary. This is essentially a colonial doctrine in which the U.S. claims that Latin America is its imperial backyard, in scare quotes. China says that the U.S. organized color revolutions, which are regime change operations in which groups, NGOs, media outlets, organizations, leaders funded by the United States through.
Most of the left critique him for simping for other imperialist bloc that his own ideology is anti-Americanism. I mean, as I pointed out, I think having an anti-American ideology means you're going to be right more often than not. And I think it betrays a lack of understanding about what imperialism is. Like, there is no other imperialist bloc. There's no other country that has 800 military bases around the world. There's no other country that controls the global financial system or the global like entertainment complex, or the global, the flow of information, or interferes in other countries' politics or governments in this way. Like, there's just no other comparison. So that's why I think that criticism kind of falls flat, and again betrays a total lack of understanding about what imperialism even is.
Cutouts, CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, and USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, they spend millions of dollars funding these regime change groups to try to overthrow independent foreign governments. Now, as an example of a color revolution in this report, China points to Ukraine in 2004 when the democratically elected president Viktor Yanukovych was forced out and they had a new election.
Imperialism is not when you trade with another country. It's not even when you invade another country. That's not what the word means. That's not what it is.
A decade later. So, I mean, the U.S. has done this repeatedly. But, people might say this is Chinese propaganda, right? That the U.S. overthrew Ukraine's government in 2004, not just 2014. But this was blatantly admitted by The Guardian, the major mainstream British newspaper. They published an article in 2004 just admitting the entire playbook for color revolutions, for U.S. regime change operations. It's called U.S. Campaign Behind the Turmoil in Kiev. And
okay, so they were behind 2004, but 2014 they had nothing to do with, even with all the U.S. politicians showing up.
So-called Chestnut Revolution, which is also known as the Orange Revolution, are Ukraine's. The campaign is an American creation, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that in 4 countries in 4 years has been used to try to salve supposedly rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. So they're admitting that the U.S. is carrying out these regime change operations. It's an American creation. And here they spell out how it's done. Funded and organized by the U.S. government, deploying U.S. consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, 2 big American parties, and U.S. NGOs, the campaign was first used in Belgrade to beat Milosevic. That is, in Serbia, to overthrow Milosevic, and then this is after the NATO wars that destroyed Yugoslavia. The U.S. ambassador in Belgrade, in Serbia, Richard Miles, played a key role. And last year, the U.S. ambassador in Georgia repeated the trick to overthrow Georgia's government and install a pro-Western regime. And they noted that then they tried to repeat it in Belarus. The U.S. ambassador in Belarus was a veteran of similar CIA operations in Central America with the Contras. So they're just admitting openly, these are U.S.-backed coups. They're in the name of so-called democracy. They're color revolutions, but they're coups. And
the foreign ministry wrote this. Like, this is what I mean. This is a serious ratcheting up in the rhetoric that they're willing to use about this. Like, I don't think we should downplay this. Like, it's a pretty serious escalation, considering how reserved China always is when he's talking about these issues.
So that they're referring to the CIA Contra terror war, and then installing the far-right oligarchy of the multimillionaire oligarch family of the Chamorros. So this is exactly what they did to steal the election from the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and they did it in
for sure,
Yugoslavia,
powerful
then they destroyed
figure.
Yugoslavia, then in,
like that. That's the. It doesn't mean that Yanukovych, the government was corrupt. Like, it's a corrupt country. That's what happens in these post-Soviet places. It leads to that kind of corruption. But that's the reality. They were being offered 2 deals under Yanukovych from the IMF and from Russia. Russia was offering them a better deal. And when Yanukovych tried to take that deal, that's when he became a target for removal. That's the reality.
Then in Serbia, and then in Georgia, and then they tried to do it in Belarus against Lukashenko, and they failed. And then they did it successfully in 2004 in Ukraine, and The Guardian boasted about it. And then they refer to this as engineering democracy. I don't know how you can call it democracy if the U.S. can engineer your democracy. That's not engineering. That is engineering. It's not democracy. That's foreign meddling. That's imperialism. And they note that The US methods, quote, have matured into a template for winning other people's elections. So they're not real democratic elections if the people of these countries are not deciding who their leaders are. It's the US deciding who their leaders are going to be. Again, this is right now I'm not reading from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. I'm reading from the Guardian newspaper, the mouthpiece of the British elite. And they name some of the organizations involved in these US-backed color revolutions, these regime change operations. They name the Democratic Party's National Democratic Institute, the Republican Party.
Oh yeah, if that's what you're referring to, Dakadune, that's right. This stuff currently right now is coming from the Guardian, which is, I think, why important why Ben's showing it, to say it's not just Chinese propaganda. It's literally the fucking Guardian and openly admitting this stuff.
Republican Institute, the U.S. State Department, and USAID are the main agencies in these so-called grassroots campaigns that these color revolutions. Also, Freedom House, which is funded by the U.S. government, and they name billionaire George Soros and his Open Society foundations. You're not allowed to mention him, but he's a longtime CIA asset who has been involved in these color revolutions and regime change operations going back to
and the Open Societies Foundation as well has played a big role in going through these social media companies and snitching on people who are peddling Russian disinformation. They're in that disinformation game now, determining what is the official narrative and what counts as disinformation and who should be grounds for removal from social media because of peddling this kind of disinformation. That's another thing the Open Societies Foundation is doing right now.
The former Soviet Union, when he was collaborating with U.S. intelligence in trying to overthrow all the former Soviet republics and the socialist governments in the Eastern Bloc in the Warsaw Pact. And the Guardian discloses that the U.S. government officially spent $41 million, and this is not adjusted for inflation, right? This is back in 2004, organizing and funding a year-long operation to get rid of Milosevic in 1999. In Ukraine, they spent around $14 million back in 2004 to get rid of Viktor Yanukovych. And then in 2014, a decade later, the U.S. backed another coup, a violent coup led by far-right extremists to overthrow the elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, once again, and to install a pro-Western regime, which set off this war in Ukraine and all of the problems that we're seeing today. So when China, in this report, is talking about color revolutions, I mean, this is an objective fact that the U.S. does this. They say that it began in 2003 in Georgia, then Ukraine, and then Kyrgyzstan. The U.S. State Department admitted playing a central role in these regime changes. They also mention, the blockade of Cuba, this illegal U.S. blockade that goes back over 60 years that has crushed the people of Cuba every single year at the UN General Assembly.
And again, I maintain that China should just build a military base in Cuba.
Because the U.S. is a rogue regime that violates international law every day.
I support that.
China points out that the U.S., the CIA, overthrew Chile's democratically elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, in 1973. So they refer to this as, this is imperialism, this is colonialism, it's the Monroe Doctrine. And they say that when the United States says America for the Americans, what they really mean is America for the United States. And that's exactly right. As a more recent example, they talk about the U.S. regime change operation in Venezuela to overthrow Venezuela's democratically elected president of Nicolás Maduro, and how CIA
Canada also deeply implicated in that as well.
Admitted this in his book. China writes, quote, "The U.S. exercises double standards on international rules, placing its self-interest first. The United States has walked away from international treaties and organizations and put its domestic law above international law." And they talk about the Trump administration's attacks on the United Nations, defunding the United Nations, the U.S. leaving UNESCO, leaving the Paris Agreement on climate change. And they also point out that the U.S. left the UN Human Rights Council under Trump, claiming that supposedly it was biased against apartheid Israel. The U.S. also, under Trump, again, this is all under Trump, the U.S. withdrew from 2 different arms treaties with Russia, which is leading to a dangerous situation today. Trump withdrew from the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which gives Ukraine the possibility to put nuclear weapons inside Ukraine right near Russia's border, which is another significant factor in this war we're seeing today. And the Trump administration withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty. So another attack on Russia, basically. So they constantly talk about the U.S. sabotaging all these agreements, pushing for war. And China says that the U.S. arbitrarily passes judgment on democracy in other countries and fabricates a false narrative of, quote,
powerful finger I wanted to mention here as well. Everyone from the West supported the Áñez dictatorship, the provisional Bolivian government. She even supposed to be awarded for something which is hilarious because she committed massacres. And when the whole Bolivia situation was going on with Morales getting couped, we saw a similar thing to what we're seeing with Ukraine or with when we see to the Nord Stream pipeline or whatever. Whereas you had people like me, for example, saying like, this is a coup. Like, what do you want? What's happening right now in Bolivia is a coup. It is a coup. And then you had instead of people like agreeing with that, you had this whole legion of these fucking chin stroking dipshits being like, well, now, like, let's hold off on this coup talk. There's no evidence of that. And also Morales is doing all these authoritarian turns with adding to the term limits and, defying the will, and people obfuscating and denying the obvious truth that's right in front of them. And again, you can be right about these incidents each and every time if you just have a basic understanding of history and pattern recognition and understanding what America's role in the world is. And you don't have to wait for the massacres to start. You don't have to wait for them to fucking admit what was going on. You can just be aware of what's going on when it's happening, and you can be against it when it's happening. And you don't have to do this thing where you're like, well, let's make sure we're not throwing around these words without evidence. Or with the SOS Cuba like last year, same thing. You always have people, the moment these things happen, denying and downplaying America's role in these situations, saying, well, we have to make sure we listen to the Cuban people or the Bolivian people. Which ones, though? That's never quite answered, and our friend Michael Parenti has some thoughts on that. But it's frustrating, just time and time again. It's the same thing. It's very clear what's going on in these situations. It's very obvious, but people are so paralyzed and so unwilling to admit the United States' role in the world and admit that it's still doing the very same activities it's been doing for fucking decades. And they routinely just like throw their bodies on the tracks to ensure that these accusations are treated as being conspiracies or tanky propaganda or whatever it is. Ooh, let's slow down on this coup talk. That was Justin Ling. That was a Justin Ling specialty. Actually, it's not a coup. Boo. Okay.
Quote, democracy versus authoritarianism to incite estrangement, division, rivalry, and confrontation. So that's China denouncing the political hegemony and the tactics that the U.S. uses to intervene in foreign countries.
Oh yeah, all the Bellingcat folks.
Then they talk about the military.
That's their job.
Hegemony. I mean, this is the most blatant of all. Everyone knows about
That's their job.
And I'm just going to read it because it's so devastating what China points out here.
The Bellingcops.
The history of the United States is characterized by violence and expansion. Since it gained independence in 1776, the United States has constantly sought expansion by force. It slaughtered Indians, that is Native Americans, indigenous peoples, invaded Canada, waged a war against Mexico, instigated the American-Spanish War, and annexed Hawaii. After World War II, the wars either provoked or launched by the United States included the Korean War, Vietnam War, Gulf War, Kosovo War, War in Afghanistan, Iraq War, Libyan War, and Syrian War, abusing its military hegemony to pave way for expansionist objectives. In recent years, the U.S. average annual military budget has exceeded $700 billion US, accounting for 40% of the world's total. So the U.S. has 5% of the global 4% of the global population, and yet 40% of the world's 40% of its budget represents 40% of the world's total military spending. I mean, ridiculous. It's just out of control. They point out that U.S. military spending is more than the 15 biggest countries behind it combined. The United States has about 800 overseas military bases with 173,000 troops deployed in 159 countries. So again, just devastating going through just these facts that are objective. This is not Chinese propaganda. These are objective facts. They note, as former U.S. President Jimmy Carter put it, the United States is undoubtedly the most warlike nation in the history of the world. And China quotes a report from a U.S. university, Tufts, that found that from 1776 until 2019, the U.S. oversaw around 400 foreign military interventions in all regions of the world. And they point out that since 2001, the wars launched by the United States in the name of so-called fighting terrorism have killed at least 900,000 people. I'll come back to that in a second because that's a very conservative estimate. And they've also led to millions of injuries and displaced tens of millions of people, creating 37 million refugees. Now, the reality is that the U.S. has killed millions of people in the wars it launched since 9/11. And I mean, even if you go back to a report that was published in 2015 by the Nobel Prize-winning organization, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, they published a report back in 2015, and it found that in 12 years of war, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. killed 1.2 million people, and that doesn't include the hundreds of thousands more.
That's what I mean.
killed
The
since
initial
then.
estimate
Again, this is from
seems
2015,
low.
8 years ago. Again, this is from a Nobel Prize-winning organization, and they say in their report that they concluded that the U.S. war in Iraq killed around 1 million people, the U.S. war in Afghanistan killed around 220,000 people, and in Pakistan, 80,000 people. It doesn't include Yemen and other regions, and they say this is a conservative estimate. The total number could be in excess of 2 million. And again, this is a report from 2015. It doesn't mention the many more deaths since then. So when China says that U.S. wars since 9/11 have killed 900,000 people, that's a conservative estimate. You can't just say it's Chinese propaganda. It's a conservative estimate. And China writes that, quote, the United States does whatever it takes to rob and enslave the people of any country with underground resources. So very powerful.
Yeah,
the U.S.
they're going
empire
off.
robs and enslaves people to take their natural
They're
resources.
kind of going off here.
China also condemns the war crimes committed by Washington in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Kosovo, that is former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The U.S. used massive quantities of chemical and biological weapons, as well as cluster bombs, fuel air bombs, graphite bombs, and depleted uranium bombs, causing enormous damage on civilian facilities, countless civilian casualties, and lasting environmental pollution. So, oof. Again, like I said, this is one of the most devastating critiques of U.S. imperialism
Ben
I've ever
loves
seen
it.
written in one place. Now, in the next part, the Chinese Foreign Ministry discusses economic hegemony.
They really did
and talks about
annihilate
how
us.
After World War II, the U.S. created the
They
international
eviscerated
financial
us in the
system,
marketplace of
built around the
ideas.
U.S. dollar through the Bretton Woods system.
Yeah, it
which-
sounds extreme because when you, but it's actually quite measured. It sounds extreme because when you just like accurately describe the way that the United States has engaged with the world, it just throughout the last 7 decades, it sounds fucking extreme. It sounds like, oh my goodness, this is so outrageous. But it's literally just listing basic facts about recent history. Like that's literally all it is. They're destroyed by facts and logic. That's right. The Iraq war alone is an insane massacre that led to nothing good. No, and it's like Iraq is still not recovered. And I saw people saying like, well, it was worth it because now they have like cell phones in Iraq. It's like, okay, fucking great job. Great. You're welcome. You're welcome, Iraq.
which also established the IMF and the World Bank. And China writes that, quote, by taking advantage of the dollar's status as the major international reserve currency, the United States is basically collecting seigniorage. So basically treating the entire world like it's feudal vassals, right? It's serfs, feudal serfs. Like the US is the feudal lord that controls the world. And China says that the US uses its control over international organizations and thus coerces other countries into serving its political and economic strategy. It points out
That's
that
imperialism.
it only cost the United States 17 cents to produce a $100 bill, but other countries have to pony up $100 worth of actual goods in order to obtain one. This is the exorbitant privilege, the dominance of the US dollar. They refer to this as the United States exorbitant privilege and notes that it helps fund the United States deficit. China notes that the US used the worthless paper note to plunder the resources and factories of other nations. So again, this is the economics of imperialism. That's what China is describing here, the economics of imperialism. China says the hegemony of the US dollar is the main source of instability and uncertainty in the world economy. Beijing pointed out that when the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, raises interest rates, this hurts other countries, especially in the global south. Developing countries face high inflation, currency depreciation, and capital outflows. This is referred to as the Triffin paradox or the Triffin dilemma. Because the US dollar is the global reserve currency, when the US carries out domestic monetary policy, it affects the entire world, especially countries in the global south that need dollars to import fuel and food and technology. And Richard Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury, he said this very clearly, that
The US is
quote,
tripping,
dollars
Doc.
are a currency, but it is your problem. So
Yeah, that was
talking
Eli
about how
Lake,
the US
Diego, that's
uses
right.
The dollar and its control over international financial organizations like the IMF and the World Bank to impose its imperialist will on the rest of the world. China writes, the United States willfully suppresses its opponents with economic coercion. And not only against adversaries like the former Soviet Union, but also against Japan. It points out that the U.S.
Even its
the
own
Classic
allies.
Board, overvalued the Japanese yen, which did a heavy blow to the growth momentum of Japan, leading Japan to 3 lost decades. China also points out
That's
quote,
what all that Japan
the US
panic was about in
US's
the
economic and
American
financial
media.
hegemony has become a geopolitical weapon. and it talks about the use of sanctions. U.S. sanctions against foreign entities increased by 933% from 2000 to 2021. The Trump administration alone imposed more than 3,900 sanctions, which is 3 sanctions per day. Now, note that they say the Trump administration alone has imposed. So
but Trump was not warlike, right? That's pushing back on that notion. Trump wasn't warlike. He didn't start any new wars. When sanctions, as we know, are an active war.
The Chinese Foreign Ministry probably wrote this report back when Trump was still
Johnny, that was Kissinger.
And then they updated it. Who knows? But they point out that the U.S. has imposed sanctions on nearly 40 countries, including Cuba, China, Russia, the DPRK, Iran, Venezuela, affecting nearly half of the world's population.
Absolutely, Jay.
China writes, the United States of America has turned
Israel
into the United States
the U.S.
of
is still
sanctions.
the U.S. is still bombing. Or sorry, the U.S. is still sanctioning Syria after the earthquake, and Israel is still bombing Syria after the earthquake. You know, it's barbaric.
So again, very powerful condemnation. Then they talk about U.S. technological hegemony. And they say the United States seeks to deter other countries' scientific, technological, and economic development by wielding monopoly power, suppression measures, and technology restrictions in high-tech fields. The United States monopolizes intellectual property in the name of protection. They know that the U.S. sabotaged Japan's semiconductor industry and waged a tech war on Japan in the 1980s. As a result, Japanese semiconductor companies were almost completely driven out of global competition. Their market share dropped from 50% to 10%. And the U.S. grabbed that market share. So this is again showing how the U.S. waged, under Ronald Reagan, in the neoliberal peak, the peak of neoliberalism, waged economic war on its own allies like Japan. China points out, quote, the United States...
That's imperialism. That's ultimately what this is a paper about, isn't it? It's just describing imperialism.
And then it talks about the attacks on Huawei. Washington is now going after TikTok, and China has been canceling visas for Chinese researchers. So again, these are facts. These are not up for dispute. These are objective facts. They talk about the U.S. attempt to prevent European countries from using China's 5G technology. And they also point out that the U.S. carries out surveillance and eavesdropping around the world and carries out cyber attacks. And China refers to the U.S. as, quote, an empire of hackers. And Beijing pointed out that any country or leader around the world can be targeted by U.S. mass surveillance, be they rivals or allies, noting that the U.S. even spied on the personal phone communications of German Chancellor Angela Merkel and several French presidents. That was one of the things we learned from the leaks from Edward Snowden. And China also quotes Julian Assange of WikiLeaks, who said, quote, do not expect a global surveillance superpower to act with honor or respect. There is only one rule. There are no rules. And then finally, China talks about U.S. cultural hegemony, which of course is also very powerful, especially in movies, TV shows, the media. The U.S. government funds cultural institutions, and this is of course a very important weapon, Hollywood. Beijing points out that U.S. movies make up
people think China's attacking the U.S. when they're just reciting factual history.
China writes, quote, when Hollywood movies descend
That's how you attack America, just by stating basic facts about things that they've done.
And they say, quote, U.S.-dominated Western media has a particularly important role in shaping global opinion in favor of U.S. meddling in the internal affairs of other countries. It talks about the U.S. government censors other social media companies. Elon Musk, who's now the head of Twitter, admitted that social media platforms work with the U.S. government to censor. Google makes pages disappear. The State Department manipulates social media. And China quotes a report in The Intercept, which found that the Pentagon, the U.S. military, was spreading propaganda on social media, on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, not only in English, but also in Arabic and other languages. And China says the U.S. practices double standards on freedom of the press. It brutally suppresses and silences media of other countries, especially Russian media. Russia Today, that's RT, and Sputnik were banned in the U.S. and Europe.
And as Lenin writes, when you talk about the free press, we love to fetishize the free press. We don't have a free press. In Canada, in the United States, in Western liberal democracies, we have a capitalist press, which is by definitionally not free and is corrupt. But we use the free press as like a cudgel to attack other countries, especially when they try to remove Western sponsored journalistic enterprises like we're seeing in Nicaragua, where Ben is located.
Twitter applications. They call this unprecedented draconian censorship. So we constantly hear in the Western media about Chinese censorship. Well, this is U.S. censorship, which we
have,
don't hear
of course, we
about.
have censorship.
And European censorship. Europe also banned Russian media because we're not allowed to hear Russian perspectives. The U.S. and European governments think we're so stupid that we can't even listen or watch Russian media because we're supposedly children and we can't hear alternative perspectives. And China points out that this U.S. propaganda and destabilization strategy, it especially targets socialist countries like China, Vietnam, Laos, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and DPRK. And China points out that the U.S. sets up news media and cultural outfits targeting socialist countries, and it bombards people with ideological infiltration. It says that U.S. mouthpieces bombard socialist countries in dozens of languages with inflammatory propaganda day and night. China says the United States uses misinformation as a spear to attack other countries and has built an industrial chain around it. So fake news. This is exactly.
And again, when any country tries to get rid of that pervasive influence of Western-backed media, what do we hear again? What do we hear from our liberal friends and our anarcho-NATO Bidenist friends or whatever, or liberal, I guess, is the same definition. What do we hear? Are they going to be able to keep their newspapers and their radio programs? That's the only thing they fucking care about, isn't it? Whenever any of these countries tries to do one thing to get out from this like relentless onslaught of Western-backed propaganda, when they do anything to try and counteract that, we get out the finger-wagging lectures, don't we? We love that. Will there be civil liberties for the fascists? I'm sorry, Robert, when the revolution comes, streaming will be forbidden. We'll find you a great job on the farm. I'd be happy to do that. Maybe I could just be the one streamer, though. You know, I could be the one good one. I could be the trusted. You need to have state media, right? You need to have the state radio station propaganda. I could do that. I have a soothing voice and persona. I'm friendly and approachable while also subversive. I think I would fit right in.
The U.S. accuses China and Russia of doing, but the U.S. is the master. The CIA created misinformation. Well, it's been around for a long time, but the CIA they mastered misinformation and fake news.
Thank you, JJ.
And the U.S. uses it to destabilize countries around the world. The U.S. created a fake Twitter in Cuba.
Yes, you will, Doc.
To spread propaganda.
You can do it on the compound.
Destabilize and try to overthrow the government.
In person, IRL.
China points out that, quote, the hegemonic, domineering, and bullying practices.
You do have to be a doctor as well.
Strength to intimidate the weak, taking from others by force and subterfuge, and playing zero-sum games are exerting grave harm. The United States has been overriding truth with its power and trampling justice to serve self-interest. These unilateral, egoistic, and regressive hegemonic practices have drawn growing intense criticism and opposition from the international community. And it concludes calling for more respect and multipolarity, true multilateralism. Countries need to respect each other. They need to be equal. China,
I'm sure America's going to change their ways now.
And power politics, and rejects interference in other countries' internal affairs. The United States must conduct serious soul searching. It must critically.
They're going to get right on that.
Let go of its arrogance and prejudice, and quit its hegemonic domineering.
It's funny to think of Biden like reading this and just being like, "Mac, what have we done?" And just all of a sudden they change their views, they change their ways. I'm sure they're going to engage in this soul-searching process. Again, they're going to get right on that.
And bullying practices. So, that is a scathing critique of U.S. imperialism, published by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China.
Fantastic.
It was published on February 20th.
Again, I don't think we should downplay how serious this is.
I'll link to it in the description below. I just wanted to go through that report because
I don't think we should downplay how serious that is. Like, that's a major kind of escalation. The fact that the PRC Foreign Ministry is starting to talk to and about America like this. Come on, Jack. We're a reluctant empire. They're just bumbling into all these things. They're just bumbling into it. That was great. And you know what? This stream was great as well. It was another wonderful day of discourse about this subject that we've been talking about for now going on 3 years. Going on 3 years, we've been talking about this narrative. It's been fascinating to watch it play out week in and week out. And I love coming on to twitch.tv to help break it down for all of you and help talk you through all of it. And in fact, some of you also helped talk me through it as well, and I appreciate you a lot. And one final time, if you do enjoy the program, you want to help keep it on the air, please subscribe to TRRS or gift subs or FriendCoin or tips or subscribe to the Patreon or whatever you can do. Every little bit helps keep this content on the air, and I appreciate it a lot. But I'm not going to do too hard of a push here because I am tired, and I am going to go. I'm going to go now. I'm leaving now. A few generous chatters could, in theory, get us over the finish line. But again, I can't hang around and try and crack the whip on this. I don't have it in me today. I don't have it in me. In this hypothetical scenario, that's right.
You can count on me. You're going to have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Mikey, thank you for the gifted sub. 5 gifted subs in the channel, Mikey. You know what that means? Mikey? Officially an elite member of the Friendship Triangle.
You can count on me. You're going to have good old
Mikey
Rob
1545
to talk you through all this.
And thanks, Part Ian, as well, for the gifted sub. Very kind of you, Part Ian. Thank you. Hell yeah. I really appreciate that, folks. Yeah, what do we got? Jesus Christ. This stupid platform. No, Adam Cole. Is Adam Cole even streaming? I don't think we're going to stream raid Adam Cole today. It was fun that one time, though. Oh, yeah, he is. He is streaming. The Chugs is streaming. Thanks again, folks. I hope you have a great weekend. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. This is a great week of TRRS. I really enjoyed hanging out with you all this week. It was productive. We got big things coming, like I said. We got Ugopnik and the Deprogram boys coming on. We got Brian Becker. Number of other suggestions as well. Number of great things coming in the near future on here. So make sure you come back. I'll be back on Monday, noon Eastern, 1 a.m. Pyongyang time. Yeah, we're figuring it out, Marty. I talked to Ugopnik today, though. We're going to figure that out over the next few weeks. Have a special weekend to you as well, Ben. Am I raiding? Did I raid? Are we done? Are we gone? Are we off? I don't know. If you're one of those people that's still somehow watching, despite the fact that I did just raid, now that they're all gone, now we can talk seriously. Now we can talk seriously now that everyone's gone. Okay? Now I can talk frankly. It's just me and Dakadude. Okay. Okay, that's all. Thank you, friends. I'll talk to you on Monday.